To kick off IGN's coverage of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 for December, they released a video which showcases the first 43 minutes of the game. Surprisingly, there were only a couple of things found worth highlighting in terms of its gameplay, but not long after its publication, they released 2 additional content one after another, which are both jam-packed with new details underneath. In addition, the second episode of KCD2's live-action series also have several notable points. So for today's discussion, we're going to examine all of them, such as those picked up from several Master Strike examples, as well as alterations to other aspects of melee combat that could influence our aggressiveness in battle, not to mention the many intriguing characteristics surrounding weapons and skills. If you'd like to check out the videos being spotlighted, their links are available in the description, alongside everything else that will be shown here. Alright, let's do this. Just like in KCD1, Henry's initial combat training orients him with basic moves, such as normal attacks and blocking. But since he already has a bit of experience, it makes sense why perfect blocks and riposts are considered part of this as well. It's quite peculiar, however, that dodging is not integrated within the fundamentals, even though they're now easier to pull off, as we've talked about before. Regardless, the instructor named Tomcat who will teach Henry advanced moves is available early in the game. But I wonder if there's any change to dodging and Master Strikes, because the ceiling of character stats has been raised from 20 to 30. If you recall, the timing window of evasion in KCD1 is directly affected by our character's agility. But since we'll now have manual control in avoiding attacks, will there be a minimum required level to learn it instead? In a similar note, Captain Bernard from the first game demanded that any of our weapons skill level be at least level 5 before he teaches Henry how to Master Strike. So I won't be surprised if the prerequisite imposed by Master Tomcat is significantly higher. This is just one of several open questions surrounding it, because up until now, we still don't know how to do such a move. In the previous analysis video, we talked about the 2 combat icons' possible function as a visual prompt for when the player should defend or attack, such as when performing perfect blocks and riposts. Since Master Strikes overlap this kind of move, the same symbols also show up when doing them, and we can tell when it actually happens, because they both light up the moment a player actuates the relevant controls. Out of all examples, they only have one thing in common, and that is the blue cross swords icon is already lit when the opposing weapons clash. This means the player's input must happen beforehand, because at this point, the unique animation for it is locked in. But in order to differentiate a perfect block from a Master Strike, there has to be an additional action apart from just pressing the defend button. At first, I had an assumption that we'll have to match the direction of an opponent's attack, but unfortunately, the visual evidence suggests otherwise. This is due to the fact that when Henry switches sides, the combat star's pointer always moves a split second earlier before his arms. So if we are required to do so, we'd see it right away even before the weapons touch. But it's very clear across all examples that the red indicator would only mirror a foe's blow when its special animation is already underway. With that said, I think the actions required for doing Master Strikes involve having to press block and attack at the same time, mainly because it makes sense when compared to the examples we've seen so far, where both things happen almost at the same time. This should also serve to clarify how it works, because in KCD1, there were a number of players who got understandably confused. After all, it's an offensive move that's done by making Henry defend himself. Meanwhile, with regards to its timing, almost all of them show the counter being activated as the opponent's swing starts to move forward, with one exception where it was pressed early on. So for now, I'll retain my initial assumption that we'll have to do it at the very last moment before an attack lands. And as Henry racks up melee combat experience, this window will gradually expand, just like in the first game. This is the only scenario I could think of, which would explain why Mr. Yersa said executing master strikes is now harder and riskier to do. Therefore, it's also very likely that the save file IGN's correspondent was using is a customized one where the character already has high stats, which could explain why their MS timing allotment seems to be relatively wide. Of course, how powerful they'll turn out to be is still inconclusive until we get our hands on it. Although Warhorse Studios is very much aware of the situation behind it in KCD1, which convinced them to make changes within the melee combat system. And sure enough, some of those qualities can be perceived from the 4 videos. We'll take a look at those next. Judging from the examples shown so far, combination attacks seem to function the same way, except for one subtle change. In the first game, every time Henry successfully finishes a sequence, his stamina recovery temporarily halts while the combo animation plays. In the sequel, the same thing will also happen, but before it does, a portion of the energy bar is recovered. This means we are incentivized to always try landing entire combos instead of singular attacks. And this instantaneous stamina regeneration is not isolated to it, because the same effect can also be observed when winning clinches. So it seems like fighting proactively is being suggested. Initially, I had a reservation if the pacing of melee combat is meant to be like this, because in IGN's preview, we've noted before that the delay time of stamina recovery when it's completely drained is quite lengthy, 6.2 seconds when I measured it, which seems to punish the player if they're too assaultive. But in the 43 minutes presentation, which presumably uses an updated version of the game, we can see the regeneration penalty within the same scenario has been drastically cut down to 2.2 seconds. In addition to the potential power of combos, we're very much aware that dodging in the first game can break a sequence of attacks. But there's one piece of evidence where it seems like this is no longer the case. Within the developer tips' intro portion, we can see the player do a combo where their first hit through a riposte was dodged by the opponent, but they continued on to do the second and third hit, which still completed the entire chain. Supposedly, according to its description, avoiding strikes within a perfect block window can make an attacker lose their balance, and therefore stop combinations. But we've yet to see any evidence of this. However, such a move does have a major upside, due to the possible existence of invincibility frames. In this same example, it's very clear that the slash from above should have connected. Instead, it passed through him, similar to how iframes work in other games. Here's another, where a thrust attack clearly would have sniped this bandit's hand, as he ducked to his right side, but it missed. And the most outrageous one of them all has got to be when Henry seemingly avoided an arrow by dodging sideways. This makes it potentially very powerful, so it's a good thing that there's a rebalancing measure done to it. Referring back to our first examination video, we've noted in the official showcase that evasion doesn't use up stamina. But in this example, which most likely uses a newer version of the game, it now drains a small portion of it, and rightfully so. Apart from the combat actions we've covered so far, a large portion of them also include details surrounding the melee weapons we'll be using. And as you'll see, some of them even include answers to leftover questions we've had before. Since pole weapons are going to be part of KCD2's standard weaponry, it's not surprising they'll now have a set of unique combination attacks. And as an added functionality, we also have visual confirmation that it's possible to pull off perfect blocks using them. However, upon seeing this two-handed spiked mace in action, I noticed its riposte is relatively slow in comparison to longswords. This leads me to suspect that balanced weapons overall will be faster for counterattacks as opposed to top-heavy ones, although it's probably affected by Henry's level as well. However, if we are to look at their raw performance, the fastest ones I've seen came from a short sword, where in some examples, the ripostes were lightning fast. And the same thing goes for its normal attacks actually. In a previous video, we talked about the possibility of preemptive attacks, where if we strike right after seeing the green shield icon, there's a good chance our hit would land first and stagger the enemy. In this recent example, Henry is armed with a short sword, while his opponent is wielding an axe. As this bandit gets ready to initiate with a slash from his right side, the symbol pops up, and the player immediately responded with a cut in the same direction, which clipped their opponent's arm. So if we're going to try doing preemptive attacks, I think our best choice will be a sword type of weapon, while top-heavy ones are also equally as interesting in their own right, especially when dealing with enemies protected by plate armor. Looking back to KCD1, we'll note that most warhammers have a spiked side on their opposite end, but we could never use them for bashing an opponent. So when I found out that this weapon exists, a German spiked warhammer, it got me very excited because its damage potential in real life is tremendous, especially when used on horseback, so I can't wait to test how powerful its in-game version is. On a similar note, there was an open question from the previous video as to whether axes with spiked tips still exist, because the thrust attack for such weapon type has been removed. It turns out this action has been retained, most likely through combinations. Therefore, the arms in question are included in the available ones, like this metal-plated battle axe, for example. As for ranged weapons like early firearms, it seems like the cons of using them greatly outweigh their benefits. Understandably, its reload time is slow. The one used in IGN's hands-on video took at least 7.5 seconds when I timed it. But the problem is, its destructive capability is questionable, depending on the ammunition used. In one clip, when an enemy bearing a shield got blasted by it, the board remained intact even though the hit was from point-blank range. Given the player was using scattershot here, which is basically a medieval buckshot, but still, at such distance, I expected the shield would have been demolished at least. If this is the case, then I think it will only be good for taking down lightly armored foes. The second type of ammo used in another footage is a lead ball, which I think is where a firearm's true power lies. The only thing we need to worry about is aiming it, because we can't lock on to a single target and there's no crosshair to speak of. You'll also notice that its activation is delayed, which I think was deliberately put in place to give us room for adjusting aim. But at the same time, that window could easily be used by our target to move sideways away from our projectile's trajectory, not to mention using them atop a horse who's not used to the sound of gunfire is a bad idea. So there's a lot to keep in mind when using them. Crossbows, on the other hand, have no new information worth parsing through just yet. But this one is worth reiterating since the last time we talked about it, because a similar thing happened again within the siege scenario. Handspan crossbows like this are very unlikely to be powerful enough for piercing steel armor, like this helmet, thus eliminating its target in one hit. And the only possible reason why it happened here is because the entire event is scripted, including the enemy soldiers, who are probably meant to perish if they got hit by a bolt anywhere. As you can see, there are a lot of things to consider about combat in its entirety. And that's not all there is, because many of the game mechanics outside of it also have new information and updates that you'll definitely want to know. You may recall in the previous video that there was an item called a Badge of Advantage, whose purpose was left a mystery. But now we know it's connected to Farkle, and it functions as a way to balance the playing field, because they can only be used if both players possess the same type of it. However, the tutorial description is vague, and I'm not certain if the badges themselves are a separate object or if they're connected to the playing dice. I hope it's the latter, because even though this activity is quite fun in the first game, its unrestricted use of loaded bones made the entire minigame imbalanced. It's almost impossible to lose if you're using a powerful set. Apart from that, we have an additional clue about the usage of Savior Snaps. If you remember, Pavlena hinted that it can be used multiple times, and in this shot, when the player salvages a bunch of them, We can see the weak variant has no power rating indicated, while the normal ones have a value of 10, which might be referring to the number of times we can save the game per unit. There's also an update with regards to Flower Power, a perk which gives Henry a +2 to Charisma if he has floral herbs in his inventory. Initially, I assumed it's been merged into Alchemy, but instead, this perk is now part of Survival. If you watched the second livestream demo, you might recall when Bohemia said that fresh herbs are better for brewing potions, which I thought was just a throwaway line because they last indefinitely in the first game. But it turns out, according to the alchemy skill description, high-grade potions require fresh ingredients. And sure enough, upon seeing these chamomile and sage on Henry's inventory, with their conditions under 100, we can safely assume that all usable plants are now perishable. In addition to Flower Power, the hunting skill is now also integrated within Survival, and therefore its level will affect not just the amount of meats we get from a prey, but also how easy it is to hunt them. Presumably, this means our distance from a wild animal before they run away will get shorter as we gain experience, instead of being tied to a perk. Meanwhile, the sharpening wheel has been altered to be slightly easier to use, because in KCD1, it's required to control the pressure being applied to a weapon as we hone it, but now we'll only have to focus on positioning the blade and rotating its stone disc. Of course, it's unavoidable that, as we learn more about KCD2, relevant questions come along for the ride, and there's a lot, especially in this video where we covered 4 of them. Just to name a few, Mr. Adrian Bushi in the live-action video said that a free hand while wielding an arming sword allow for better body coordination, and we can see one of the combatants practice their head movement. It's very interesting, but what does that mean for the character? Does the invincibility frames window expand when dodging in this setup? At one point, we can also see Henry during a fight smack an enemy with his torch in place of a shield. What kind of damage does it do? And can we use it for attacking as well? It's basically a wooden bludgeon on fire after all. Whichever weapon we decide to use at any given time, I think the situational buffs are going to be very important, meaning those ones which automatically activate when a certain condition is met. The details behind these new perks are still shrouded, except for the fact that there are a lot of them. And at first I thought the number of buffs we'll get to use is limited to 6 at a time, because it's the amount of display slots visible in the character sheet. But in one clip, we can clearly see 8 of them running in parallel, and that's not taking into account the effects of potions yet. So I'm really curious to find out how they'll all stack up. In any case, I will continue to monitor the videos being published out there, and by the looks of it, things will only get busier now that we're just a few weeks away from its release. In fact, as of this recording, there's already a queue of footages building up waiting to be studied, so I'll make sure to report back to you if I find things worth talking about.